Welcome to Birkbeck Inspires. I'm Ron Smith. I've been in Birkbeck since 1976, mainly teaching econometrics and statistics. And today I'm going to talk about the national debt, a horror show. I'm afraid this one's not going to be as frightening as a previous Birkbeck Inspires on zombies, but you may know that recently the national debt has passed 100% of GDP, both in the US and in the UK. GDP, gross domestic product, is the total output or income of the economy. So is it a bad thing having our debt bigger than our income? Rishi Sunak, this Chancellor, didn't think so, and it was him who said there was going to be no new horror show of taxes. Now, it's not a good idea to compare countries with households. In this case, it's quite useful. Anybody who's had a mortgage has had debt income ratios of 300%, very large compared to what we've got at the moment. Now, the comparison's not exactly right, because whereas you have to save to pay off, governments have the great advantage that they can pay off their interest by just printing money. Obviously they can't do that too much because people wouldn't trust the money, but and countries which do inflate too much can't borrow in their own currency. They have to borrow in a foreign currency, typically in dollars. But the UK can borrow in sterling, and most of the people that it's borrowing from are UK citizens, and also the Bank of England, who provides them with quite a lot of the financing under quantitative easing. But the central issue is credibility, the belief that the government will repay. And that's the same for your mortgage. Certainly the bank has collateral. It could repossess your house, but it doesn't want to do that. It's bad for business and it's expensive. It would much rather lend to people who can repay, and so borrowers can borrow as long as they've got credibility, as long as the lenders trust them. And in fact, on US currency, it says, "In God we trust." In UK currency, it says, "I promise to pay," and it's signed by the cashier at the Bank of England. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about the history of the debt to put our 100% of GDP figure in context. And I've got a slide here of British national debt as a percent of GDP from 1700 to 2016. This comes from a lovely Bank of England spreadsheet called a Millennium of Macroeconomic Data, and we have data going back to the Doomsday Book. But the British national debt is usually dated as starting in 1694, when William of Orange got a syndicate together to lend him money in order to fight a war. And that syndicate became the Bank of England and stayed in business of lending money to the government until it was nationalised in 1946. So if you look at the graph, essentially it started off as zero. In 1694 there was no national debt, and then there's a steady sawtooth pattern going up, flattens off a bit, goes up, flattens off a bit, goes up, flattens off a bit, goes up, flattens off a bit. And during the 18th century they discussed this, and they worried about the national debt all the time, but worrying about it didn't stop the debt going up till it peaked around 200% of GDP. So our current figure of 100% is about half what it was at the end of the Napoleonic War. And so why was the government borrowing? Well, for pretty much the same reason that William III had borrowed in the first place. That was to fight wars. And if you look at the next picture, it's the share of military expenditure in GDP over the same period. I do quite a lot of work on military topics, and you can see these peaks as share of military expenditure was going up to around 15% and down, up, down. And so these are just the major wars. Britain was fighting wars almost continuously during the 18th century. And they're fighting so many of them, and I'm not a historian, I can't remember what they're called. So I've got a list of them here. The 18th century, each of these major wars roughly doubles the national debt. 9 Years' War, War of Spanish Succession, Austrian Succession, 7 Years' War, American Revolutionary War, French Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars, during which the share of military expenditure was over 15% of GDP. And this list doesn't include lots of the smaller wars. And in fighting these wars, Britain had a secret weapon, and it was called the Britain's secret weapon at the time, and that secret weapon was the national debt. Britain had good credit, so it could borrow. Because it could borrow, it could finance its allies and finance the military spending. Because it had plenty of money, it won the wars, and the people it fought against, typically France, having lost the war, defaulted, made their credit worse. So Britain could finance the wars very easily. And it financed the wars very easily because relative to France, it had an efficient tax system and Parliament gave it legitimacy. So there was a natural positive cycle, virtuous cycle for the UK, for Britain at that time, in terms of the development. Then it declined from a peak of around 200%. It declined very, very steadily to around 20% in 1913. And it declined because there wasn't very much expenditure on the military. Essentially, it was 2.5% of GDP went to the military. A little blip there with the Crimean War and the First Indian War of Independence, and another blip for the Boer War, and then there were the two World Wars 1 and 2, but the Victorian period allowed it to pay off the national debt. And one of the interesting things about credibility here is that what people trusted in was the British government paying the interest, because the debt which it had, consols, was a debt in perpetuity. They didn't have to pay it back. The government could pay it back if it wanted to, but it didn't have to. It could just go on paying interest. And in fact, the last of it was paid off in about 2015, just to taking advantage of the low interest rates. And again, we got the two world wars, so that at the end of the Second World War, it was around 250% of GDP. And the debt then steadily fell as a proportion of GDP to around 30%. Then it started to rise slightly, but then rose very sharply with the financial crisis, when GDP fell and tax revenues fell and government expenditures became large. What's crucial in this balance is the balance between what the rate of interest is and what the growth rate of GDP is. If the rate of interest is greater than the growth rate of GDP, then you're paying off more than's being offset by the growth in GDP. And it's that balance. At the moment, interest rates are very, very low, so the government can borrow at very little cost. And again, it depends on perceptions. And it depends on the market's perception of the credibility of the government. And market perceptions can change very, very quickly. Greece was borrowing at 3%. Then, during the Eurozone crisis, it went up to 30%. Now, just before at the end of 2019, it was down to 1% it could borrow at, despite the fact it had debt GDP ratios of 186% and was classified as junk by the rating authorities. But the position of the UK at the moment, interest rates are low. Austerity would probably do more damage than continuing to borrow, because if you raise government expenditure if you cut government expenditure or raise taxes, that's going to depress GDP, making the problem worse. So I think that Rishi Sunak was right. There's not going to be a great horror show in terms of doing it. And I hope you've enjoyed this little history of British national debt. And if you want to find out more, do check the Birkbeck website, www.bbk.ac.uk. And thank you for watching.